I've always been angry with situations that showed some level of injustice. So I've seen how sexual abuse can change the life of a survivor. I've seen situations where somebody was abused, they're alive. We've seen 3-month-old babies get raped. We've seen 80-year-old women get raped. So there's really no basis for any of these kind of biases and conversations.
Welcome to another episode of Her Media Diary, a podcast that captures the lived experiences of African women working in media industries. I am Dr. Yemsi Akimbobola, your host, and in this episode, I'm joined by Soyem Osakwe, a multidisciplinary global communications specialist, researcher, and corporate trainer. Soyem is passionate about social change, and she's done a lot of work around gender-based violence advocacy, working with organizations like Partner for Justice, the Maribel Center, and Clean Foundation. In this episode, Soyem and I look at the impact of sexual harassment and gender-based violence reporting on survivors and the approaches she believes are best as a communications specialist. Now, to give some context, in 2020, African Women in Media and Foyo Media Institute conducted research that looked at barriers faced by African women working in media. One of the most prominent barriers was sexual harassment, and throughout this series, we'll be in conversation with African women working in a range of media industries to discuss the various issues that emerged from the research. By inviting these voices into conversation, we hope to provide solutions to break down barriers faced by African women in media. Before we start though, a quick disclaimer to our listeners. Sexual harassment and gender-based violence is a sensitive topic and one that can be distressing and triggering. In the show notes, we have included links to helplines, support groups, and organizations that specialize in supporting survivors of sexual harassment and violence. All right, so yeah, it's a pleasure to speak with you today and to have you on this podcast on this very important topic around sexual harassment and gender-based violence. But let's start with getting to know you a bit more. So yeah, tell us about you and all the way back when.
Okay, thank you. It's so good to be here and to talk to someone about this. So my name is Soyem and I'm a communications consultant, studied mass communication, and then I have a master's in marketing communications and currently studying for a second master's in global communications. So it's like, so yeah,
We love studying,
yes,
don't we? Us Nigerians, we like
yes.
studying, or Africans generally. So second and third masters are not uncommon.
Yeah, so in the last 4 or 5 years, I've been working with women and NGOs that support survivors of gender-based violence, specifically sexual violence. And my work really started with Partnership for Justice, which is they are the managers of the Mirabel Center and the Nana Khadija centers in Sokoto and Lagos, respectively. And some of the work I've done since I've been there is basically to tell the story of survivors who normally wouldn't get the exposure, as in not just telling talking about the assault, rather talking about the problem of gender-based violence in Nigeria and the challenges that NGOs like the Mirabel Center face in trying to support survivors in terms of, is there medical help, is there psychosocial help, what do survivors grapple with in terms of how do they even come forward in the first place, what challenges do they face when they report abuse to police officers, are they further victimized, so things like that. So I highlight the issues regarding sexual violence, and I've been working with both NGOs. So I've worked with Mirabel Center, I've worked with Nana Khadija Center in Sokoto. I've also trained women advocacy groups, Clean Foundation, and the Union Women. I think 2021 sponsored about 40 women advocacy groups in Lagos who basically deal with sex trafficking and human trafficking. And the concern really was about gender-based violence because survivors of that also experience that. So training them about media and communication. So that's basically what I do. But I've also done a bit of work for the private sector as well.
Yeah, before we get into the nitty-gritty of this very heavy topic, let's know a bit about you though. Like, tell us where you're from. Like, what's your background? Where, your history, your story.
Okay, I'm from Delta State, and like I said, I studied mass comm. I wanted to be a broadcaster when I was going in to study mass communication.
Why did you want to be a broadcaster? What led you down that
I
path?
think I was inspired like by people like Eugene Abu, NTA, Tokumbo Ajayi. Those were the ladies then who were, there was a way with the way there was a way they talked about the news, and I felt it was interesting. So I always wanted to be a broadcaster. But when I got to school, I realized maybe not broadcasting, maybe PR. So
Okay.
I tilted more towards public
Well,
relations.
let's pick up on that a second because we've done research that actually looks at the difference between the number of women that go into studying journalism, broadcast, and all that versus the number of women that enter the industry, because a lot of them then switch to that more PR communications kind of background. So I'll be interested to hear from your perspective, like why this switch?
I think at the time I was looking at prospects for job and for growth, and I was like, okay, NTA seems to be like the hallmark of broadcasting. That was the time. I mean, the stations like channels. I went on to try on NN24. In fact, I presented sports on NTA to be precise, because I'm a football fan. So,
Okay.
so I presented sports as an intern on NTA. But I never really thought it was going to be my thing. I always wanted to do several things at the same time. So maybe that spurred my movement from one to another. I mean, I'm still interested in TV and stuff like that, but it's not like a crucial thing for me.
Mm. So what was that like presenting sports on NT? Like how did that even happen?
So at the time, we had like a mandatory
Okay.
internship, which we had to do in our 300 level.
Industrial training, I think they called it.
I went to NTA Benin and I had a mentor there. He was the sports presenter, and he was like, "Look, you talk football. Are you sure you won't go on air today?" And I was terrified. I was like, "Really? Okay, I'm good." So I went and I presented football, and people were calling like, "Okay, who is this girl talking football?" So I enjoyed it. Okay, I still got to present and all of that, but I was terrified truly in front of the camera. um, but yeah, I enjoyed it very much. But I always thought that maybe storytelling for organizations was more my thing towards the completion of my first
Mm.
degree.
So how did you get into that? Because you've set out already a few organizations you've worked with and for in the last few years. So how did you get into that storytelling for social impact? Really, is what you do, isn't it?
Yeah, correct. I think it started with so I had experience with PR, with advertising, because after I graduated, I worked with international agencies that had done some PR, social media, digital campaigns. But towards mid 2018, I became quite maybe upset. I think I was seeing a lot of stories about rape in the news, and it just really bothered me. And I just kept wondering, what can I do? And I realized that the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. So I started writing non-profit organizations who were women centered. Do you need help with communications? I can volunteer to do this for you for free. I'm not going to charge you anything. Coincidentally, I think it was just the Mirabel Center that reached out and said, okay, yeah, we have someone in house, but we would like you to really help us with this. And at the time, I'd really built, because I'd had some experience with digital communications, done campaigns and all of that. I could see how I could grow their social following to not just increase their advocacy, but to really, it's like driving support for their cause, because I felt it was something that women all over Nigeria could relate with, women globally could
Mm,
relate with. And I had a skill set to push this. So that's how I got on board first as a volunteer. Then I started to recruit other volunteers because it was something that a lot of people really, it resonated with so many people. So actually men, women started to come on board wanting to be volunteers. A lot of individual donors, coincidentally, who happened to be men as well, really wanted to support the cause. So that's how I got into it. I started by
mm.
just saying, you know what, just being, because I could really be very passionate. So I just started to drive everyone. This is what we need to do. This is what we need to do. And that's how it took off in 2018.
So, reflecting on the many projects that you would have done in that time, tell us about your first main one that you really felt that you had impact.
Okay. I would have to say it was the one in 2021. So, I mean, I'd worked on several projects, but in 2021, the Duchess of Cornwall, Camilla, agreed to be the. She agreed to
My
be.
eyes are like popping, right?
She,
Because that was so not the name I was
yeah,
expecting to hear, but okay.
yeah, I know. So she took on the patronage of the Mirabel Center, making her the very first patron of the the center. I think that when we discovered that she had agreed, the concern was, oh, how do we announce this, and what's the communication going to be? And then I had to do some research. I realized that, oh, Camilla had done some of this work for women in the UK. She's passionate about survivors of domestic violence, gender-based violence, and I wrote the press release. We got over 100 publications globally. I mean, the very top publications and media organizations, CNN and all of that, they published it. But we did it in collaboration with, of course, her team in the UK. But I felt that that was one of the most successful campaigns, because it was like a combination of all the work that we had done in terms of the visibility that had been gained over the period, the fact that we were getting, even before she came on board as a patron of the center, during the 16 days of activism in 2020, the Twitter account for Prince Charles had highlighted the work that the Mirabel Center does. I feel that some of those mentions organically you get from really
Mm.
reputable individuals, organizations, are a way to validate the work that you do. So that's what I would say.
I mean, let's dig into that a bit more, because essentially what it is that you had these big names who then drew,
Yeah.
bigger than big. I would say they're kind of in their own, in their own space. Really, there's nobody else that can compare to them
Yeah.
to draw really important visibility to this topic of gender-based violence, right? So let's think about that in the broader sense of the importance of role models, of
Yes.
influencing, of social, and the impact of social media, because it's really social media that is making this impact as well, alongside the big names. So how, reflecting on your work and thinking about the need for us to do more, especially in countries like Nigeria. I think you'd said one of your engagements, I can't remember whether it was written or video, that pre-existing biases in society, right, influences the biases continue. So in terms of things like the positions of women in society, and therefore how that then relates to things like gender-based violence. But also when we look at media reporting on it, the language use is problematic, and that also is a reflection of the society, right? Thinking about all of those things, the role of influencers, of social media, of kind of the societal biases,
Yeah.
what are some of the things, based on your experience, that you would see as a way forward? What is the importance of these voices, of these big names in this
Such a good
conversation?
question, actually, because from my experience with nonprofits generally, the issue really is not that the cause is not important. It's that they don't have the visibility to get it to the tables where they need to get it to. So voices like celebrities, ambassadors help to push it to the next level. For example, when I joined the Mirabel Center, they had ambassadors, but they were not engaging the ambassadors. What this means is that you have people who really want to advocate for you, but they don't really have the material to push. So one of the things I did was I started to push out material which resonated with the celebrities. For example, you have people like Kate Henshaw, you have Aisha Yusufu, you have
Mhm.
Wana Wana, you have Dakori. These are people who, Egoboyo, they are passionate about women. So when they push these things, it means that the policymakers are paying attention to celebrities. They are paying attention to what they say and what they think is important. So that means that the issues of gender-based violence between 2020 and 2021 became like a front burner issue, not just because of the voices and the movements that happened, but also because, I think during the 2020 lockdown, things really escalated in terms of femicide in Nigeria, which was hardly talked about, in terms of rape, in terms of domestic violence. So what happened was you had the strong voices of advocates, but you had the power and the weight of celebrities actually pushing that as well. So that really resonated and made government and policymakers pay attention. So it was during the 2020 lockdown that, for example, movements such as End Gender-Based Violence Now, State of Emergency, Gender-Based Violence Now, it was basically pushing government actors into a corner and politicians, making them enforce some kind of action. And for them, it was, oh, we are declaring a state of emergency on gender-based violence. I'm not sure what action that actually
Mhm.
or what that achieved, but it basically meant that even if it was eye service, they were paying attention to the conversations that were happening. And that means that subsequently governments at states levels, at the federal level, started to take action to actually curb it.
You said there that one of the challenges is that for some organizations, they don't really know how to engage the ambassadors to effectively use them for that social impact that you're talking about. So,
Yeah.
for those in the field that are listening to this call, whether media, whether comms, whether NGOs, what would be your go to strategy to engage in ambassadors when it relates to using media and using comms channels effectively to advocate for policy change when it comes to gender based violence and sexual harassment? Maybe you can talk about both separately as well.
I think that the way to engage people first is to understand who are you talking to? Who do you need to reach? I mean, that's the very, very basis of communication in the first place. Who is my audience? Who am I trying to reach? I think that a lot of us forget that when we're planning strategies or doing all of that. So let's say you're trying to get, even if it's the state governor, to look at something that you're doing, whether it's you're supporting women who have been abused, or you're building a shelter, or you're trying to rescue victims, whatever it is. So you already have a cause, and that cause is important. Next is to say, who is concerned about this? Because sometimes these people are just looking for important things to support, but they don't know how to partner with organizations as well. So it could start from inviting them, for example, to be on a Twitter space. It could start from a conversation with the founder of the NGO and the celebrity, and just having a conversation. What do you think about this? What do you think about this? One of the things we did, and that I actually led during the lockdown, for example, was approach this from a different angle. I understand these are women based issues, but we need men as allies to make progress. So one of the things the founder of the Mirabel Center did was start a movement called Men Against Rape.
Mm,
So men against rape are men who say, they are the ones who get offended when you say, well, men are rapists. And they say, no, well, not all men. So if you say not all men are rapists, what are you doing in your corner to actually change the tide? So it started with social media. Would you like to march against rape? Are you fed up with the stories about rape and girls being killed in various parts of the country? Would you like to sign? Because we had like something on the wall where you sign and say, I'm saying no to rape. And we had police officers, we had LASMA officials in Lagos, we had celebrities, actors, just men, radio hosts who just went on the streets of Lagos saying, we're tired of our sisters getting raped. We need the justice system to take action. We need the police to enforce and to arrest culprits. And they marched where? To the wife of the governor, saying, we want some action to be taken. I think that it starts with understanding what your cause is, who is likely to be interested and who is passionate about it, and just forming these conversations organically without necessarily, because they are organic conversations, they are about human rights, they are conversations that we have every day, but sometimes maybe one person is not paying attention. So it's just that continuous engagement to say, this is it, this is it, this is it. I could tell you, for example, that just by having these conversations and engagement with celebrities, we've been growing our social following.
mm.
By the time one celebrity tweets, oh, there's this judgment and conviction of a rapist, we have 100 followers. It just tells you that there's a good blend between the what the ambassador is passionate about and what the center is doing.
And to expand more in terms of this topic on gender based violence, because we also have things around human trafficking, right, and forced migration. And I think last year you worked with Clean Foundation to train media and chief security officers on communication strategies that highlight human trafficking and forced migration of young girls and women in Nigeria. So tell us about that project. What was it like, and why was it so important for you to be a part of it? And also, how you did it and what came out of it.
Okay, so I was contacted by the Clean Foundation. Someone at the Mirabel Center had referred me to them. So it was something I was, excited to do. And I got to meet women who are really at the grassroots, rescuing girls and children who have been trafficked. And prior to that time, I was aware that Nigeria had a sex trafficking, human trafficking problem, because I don't know if you recall, many years ago, there was this project. It was and the wife of the former vice president, Titi Abubakar, she had this program called Izozo, where she had highlighted the problem of sex trafficking, especially in Edo State. I schooled in Edo State Secondary School, so I was well aware of the problem. So when I went into this project, I knew about
Mm.
the issues. I didn't know how widespread and pervasive they were, especially amongst secondary school girls, and the fact that most of the people who were trafficking them were people that they knew. So even religious leaders and clergy and people that they trust, teachers. And I think that the strategy going into this particular project was saying these women do such a fantastic job, and most times there are challenges trying to reintegrate the victims back into society, helping victims deal with trauma and stigma, helping them basically start a new life. And sometimes their work is not really highlighted because there's this gap between what they do and the agenda set by the media. So when I came in there, I was basically saying you have collaborative relationship with the media. Of course, there are guidelines and ethics about reporting about victims, but just like gender-based violence, human trafficking and sex trafficking need to be on the agenda as well. It's not getting the visibility that it needs, and that means that the government and politicians are not really paying attention to this issue. There's NAPTIP, which is doing a good job with helping to rescue and all of that. But in terms of media visibility, which is you need people to be active bystanders to pay attention to the fact that it could be their sister who is being trafficked. She could be chatting with someone online who is promising her a scholarship, and it could be a trafficking thing. So, so the module I presented was basically you need to work collaboratively. So let's say there's a case of a child who is missing. The media needs to highlight that. If it's not in the media, people are not going to pay attention to the fact that, oh, this is not just one case. This is something that's happening within a particular locality and something that needs to be taken care of. And you also need that to get to the tables of those who actually can change things and make policy that can help victims.
And for the next 3 years at African Women in Media, we are training women journalists in Nigeria on reporting violence against women and girls in Nigeria. So it's our first kind of country-focused project, supported by the MacArthur Foundation and the Wole Soyinka Center for Investigative Journalism. And really, so many issues emerge when it comes to media reporting of violence against women and girls. Not just in terms of organizations that they should be working with, but also just things like language, right? So the problematic use of certain kind of language in media reporting where you're almost victim blaming some of the things that you said there, even the media kind of perpetrating that victim blaming. And it's really, like you said, that reflection of the pre-existing biases in our society, right? So that means that we're using certain language to refer to victims or survivors of rape, people who blaming people for their trafficking, what are you looking at? Those kind of
Mhm.
very insensitive narratives. So when you think about your work and your experience with media in terms of the structuring of the narratives, what would you like to see happen differently when it comes to advocates for against gender-based violence, when it comes to media and considering media's kind of obligations for objectivity, bias, but also raising awareness, right? So that people can be informed and therefore shape policy. So what do you see as the biggest gaps for you, and how would you like to see those gaps filled, addressed rather?
Okay, thank you so much. That's such a good question and something that I've become very interested in. So I just completed research on the media framing of sexual violence in Nigeria, and I had very interesting findings.
Mm,
I think prior to that time, I'd looked at language generally and narratives by the media. And one thing I would say is contemporary media in Nigeria seems to be more interested in sensationalism. So awareness is important about gender-based violence and rape, for example. But I mean, where you have a media organization publish a video of a child getting abused,
mm,
it raises questions as to how did we get here and how is this even okay. So I analyzed a total of 389 newspaper reports between 2020 and 2022. There are news reports from The Guardian and from Punch. And I was looking at language. And first of all, I said, okay, of course you can't be biased going into this. You just have to allow, I allow the software do most of the work, which is just see the narratives being presented. And things I saw were quite startling. So across both organizations, for example, how are victims talked about? So the things they talked about most for victims are the age of the victim, where the victim is from, in some cases, the sexual status of the victim prior to the attack. So they talk about, oh, the victim was a virgin before she was raped, or the reporter asked the perpetrator, because they also give perpetrators so much media space to share their views, which is alarming. So then the perpetrator says, oh, she's an olosho, and then the reporter writes in translation, a commercial sex worker. And I was just, okay, so these are these are the issues. And so I was alarmed. And in describing perpetrators, some media reports describe perpetrators as an admirer, a randy man. These are how perpetrators are described. And in some cases, they would ask the perpetrator, okay, so why did you do this? And the perpetrator would say, oh, I spent ABCD money on her, or my friend spent ABCD money on her. So we felt it was within our rights. So, just pushing again those narratives. And I understand that the journalist is trying to get his clicks in terms of digital media, or he's trying to get get his report, but it's alarming the impact that has on survivors. The fact that it's treated with such it's so trivial. It's as if it's soft sell that no one wants to go to the media to actually be talking about cases like this. Because when I looked at it, I said, no, this is a problem. And the fact that between 2020 and 2022, most of the frames the media used were episodic frames. You're dealing with something that has become a problem, a national problem, but you're talking about it as though it were a one-off.
It's happened.
Yeah, so I noticed that I counted up to 25 cases where children actually died from rape, but the emphasis was not on the fact that girls were being killed and raped. The emphasis was that people were dressing indecently. Girls should cover up. The emphasis was that parents should keep their children at home so that if they're not outside, then they cannot be raped. There's something we always say, those of us who have ever done some level of advocacy, is that tell us any situation where you think somebody couldn't have been raped, and we'll show you instances where it happened. We've seen 3-month-old babies get raped. We've seen 80-year-old women get raped. So there's really no basis for any of these kind of biases and conversations.
Yeah, and you said that the danger it presents for the survivors, right, in terms of how it makes them feel, and for future survivors, in terms of their ability to come out and to speak, but also in terms of normalizing horrible behavior
Yeah.
by calling them, oh, it's a randy man, and like you said, where they say, oh, it was the
Mm,
devil,
yeah.
those kind of things, right? Normalizing those kind of narratives, and I think that's really some of the things that we've been trying to tackle over our program. But I want to take us a bit further back in something you said earlier on, because you said that you had schooled in Edo State. So, what I was going to say, so to take us back to your schooling in Edo State,
Okay.
was it apparent in your environment then, as somebody in secondary school in Edo State, this was a big issue in the state?
So I attended the federal school, and at the time, federal schools were a mixture of people from all over the country. So that means that we were not indigenes of Edo State. But one thing which was common was that a number of then schoolmates would look forward to traveling to Europe after school. Initially, I didn't get the idea. I thought, okay, maybe family is based in Europe, so you leave school and then you go for your higher education or your university in Edo State. But when it became apparent that okay, we may not be talking about the same thing, was you would see they talk about, oh, some young girls have built, like they've come back from their travels abroad, and they now have like some form of wealth, or they've established business back at home. And I started to understand that the first lady then of Edo State, Eki Igbinedion, she was also very vocal about trying to change the system because it was embedded. It was something that was expected from people who were indigenes at the time. I think that it wasn't common in my school, but it was just, it had its own, we knew, but
There was an undercurrent.
yeah, there was, yeah, exactly. We knew that, okay, this happens, and we were not quite sure as to why it happened because I think it was like a family movement. You finish from school, then you go, and then you come back and you establish that kind of thing. So that's the way we looked at it.
I'm also trying to get a handle as to how you started in this journey of advocating for this particular topic. So do you want to take us a bit back also? Because it sounds like it was a lot more than just a job and studies for you. It's something that you're really passionate about. So where did the passion come from? Or just passion for social change generally?
I would have to say it's passion for social change. I think I've always been dissatisfied with injustice generally. And I think that we're not really aware, as in those of us who grew up in Nigeria, we're not really aware of how inequality functions. Sometimes we just think, oh, it's the way we do things, but not really. I think that in 2018, in fact, in 2017, I was reading a report. Then I, I was on a vacation in the UK. I was reading a report about a child who had been raped in Nigeria, and I just became so
Yeah,
angry.
I remember that story.
And I could not understand why I was that angry. Then in 2018, I read about a child who wanted to go to school and was in school, was living with her auntie, and the auntie's husband and son raped her and she died. I think that's completely shattered me, and I just needed to do something because I think that anger can propel us into different places. Like for me, it's I need to help survivors. For me, that's the push. The more I read about, it doesn't matter. Survivors are survivors. But when I read about, it's like taking a child away from the life that they should have lived, taking them away from, it's something else. And because I've also been at events where I've seen how sexual abuse can change the life of a survivor. I've seen situations where somebody was abused, they're alive, but they've had to do up to 12 reconstructive surgeries to even be able to use the bathroom. And I've seen situations where father, uncle, brother had assaulted the same person. I've seen and heard of situations where boys cannot even speak about their abuse because society doesn't believe girls. How can boys say they were raped? So it's, for me, this is it.
Yeah. That's another angle of this, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is that actually the abuse and gender-based violence can happen to all genders,
Yes.
right? And
Yes.
so if we think about the fact that the society kind of silences women and girls in speaking, and there's this kind of societal prescription about what men should be or what boys are. So it's again, it's another level of silencing everybody, really.
Yeah, that's it. The silencing everybody. And when you look at the fact that when you ask some people, sometimes somebody discloses to you, and then they tell you, "So thank you for your advocacy. I've been seeing your post, and because of that, I'm able to speak." We worked a long time ago together. We're colleagues. She was like a mentee. We were quite close, and she told me I could never tell you I'd been abused when I was 6, and then she found the courage to speak out almost after 20 years. It tells you how
Mm.
much people have had to endure because they're afraid of a society where victim blaming is rife, where people can just, I mean, some years ago, we saw a popular actor say that mothers should be careful with the way they dress children because children could seduce men. So, so,
Mm.
so we've heard it all. It's ridiculous.
It is. And so, where do you think that your passion for social change emerged? Like, what's your earliest memory of this passion for social impact?
Um, my mom will say that though I was a quiet child, I've always been angry with situations that showed some level of
Like you did.
injustice. So, because I didn't even know, I would actually have called myself, oh, just a quiet child. But I think that it also comes, part of it is my faith, I must say. Being a Christian, I think that thing of injustice, that's why when people try to misrepresent God, I'm like, probably don't know him. Like, I think that yes, like I do. So I'm like, because there's something about the downtrodden, the one who is vulnerable, the one who has nobody to push for them. I think that that's where it comes from. Just saying that the oppressor can just walk away, not held accountable for what they have done. And in most cases, that's it. Because the truth is that we live in a society where people feel that women are liars. They want to bring famous men down. So they are going to come up with all forms of allegations about rape and assault. And we need to protect men because these girls are out to destroy the reputations and the careers of successful men. So that's where it comes from. It comes from wanting to basically shine the light on the fact that, look, abuse can happen to anybody. It can happen to anybody, men, women, famous, rich, poor, whatever. So it doesn't, you have to look at it like
It doesn't
at
discriminate.
all, at all, at
It
all. So,
doesn't
so you,
discriminate.
at all. So you have to look at it and say, look, it could happen to anyone. So I think that for me, it's saying these are the things to look out for. My advocacy has helped me also to learn that there are some telltale signs for children and things that parents can look out for to help protect their children. I mean, there's no 100% protection from all of this, but just to know what to do and to pay attention to the signs that could probably be telling us that something wrong is happening around here.
And of course, another dimension of this, because as an organization, African Women in Media, we're both interested in women as workers of media, but also how media represents women in media content. There's also for the aspect of women in media, or women journalists specifically, of sexual harassment in newsroom and the kind of violence that they, gender-based violence that they experience. So have you done any work around that? And, what are your thoughts on kind of the real change that needs to emerge from there?
Okay, I haven't done any work about that, interestingly enough, but I've always been curious because while I was doing my research about media framing, I was curious to know some of the reports and narratives we see, are they from men, male journalists, or are they from female journalists? Is there a difference between the way female journalists, for example, report gender-based violence, and is there a difference between, because I think that we've heard reports about abuse in newsrooms and all sorts of things, but I've not really done anything. But they also, I know that their research, when I was reading for my research, I saw quite a number of literature on that, but I haven't done anything on that.
Okay. So, if we think about all the things we've talked about today, your years of experience, the kind of work that you've done on different levels in addressing gender-based violence. So, what are the gaps in all of this work that you and everybody else is doing in Nigeria that you'd like to see addressed? What are the things that's not yet been done that you'd like to do? And, what are your plans to do them?
Okay, so one of the things which is getting addressed but still needs a really strong hold is accountability for perpetrators. So right now we have the Violence Against Persons Act, the VAP, which is quite popular. It has been passed in over 20 something states. The UN Women, they've done quite an incredible job ensuring that state actors are passing this. The Child Rights Act is also passed in a number of states, but we have some kind of challenge in some of the states in the north, for example, where religion and the act are having there's a clash between all of that. So, for example, it was such a relief to pass that in Sokoto State. That was 2 years ago, and we're quite happy that that happened. But going forward, it's not just to have laws in place that hold perpetrators accountable. It's actually to ensure that these instances of gender-based violence are reduced. And by that I mean, so yes, hold them accountable. Yes, ensure that the laws are in place. But we realize that when victims go to report to policemen, and we have a certain number of police desks have been trained. We have the gender desk in Nigeria where victims can go and report. We realize that sometimes the police are the ones who put pressure on the survivors not to proceed further. So the survivor feels, I don't have any options here. I have to just go back into my shell. We want a situation where perpetrators, the speedy prosecution of perpetrators, that it becomes so common to see perpetrators go to jail, because Lagos is doing such a good job in that regard. Lagos State, we've had the most conversations. Jigawa State is doing such a good job. But it's to do more and to show, and advocacy must be carried everywhere, because I think at the bottom of it all is still the bias and the things that we've come to know, that, oh, men are superior to women, men can grab women, men can touch women, and all of that. It needs to be said that it can't happen. It's unacceptable. So another thing is that most of the laws also just prosecute rape. But we've also seen situations where victims of sexual harassment, for example, somebody who was tugged at, touched, becomes so traumatized, in fact, more traumatized than somebody who has been raped. And it tells you that we have to focus on all levels of sexual and gender based violence. It's also the thing about protecting those who are vulnerable. We do not have shelters in Nigeria. We always say leave to live, but where are they living to? To be quite honest, nobody's living anywhere, because where are the facilities to help those who need to run away and who need to run for their lives? So we need shelters. One of the things that the Nana Khadija Center in Sokoto has, they have a shelter now for men, young men, women who have been in vulnerable situations. But much more needs to be done across state levels. We need shelters to protect women from abusive husbands. We need shelters to protect women fleeing abusive situations. Sometime in 2020, private organizations reached out, and I was able to, so they built an app to help report gender-based violence and rape for women who were fleeing abusive situations. And then we also had ride-hailing companies like Bolt say, okay, that they could provide emergency transport for women who were running to shelters and to centers like the Mirabel Center. So those are the kind of things that government need to do. Also, funding sexual assault referral centers. Right now, we have 32 sexual assault referral centers in the country, but not every state has. And most of the ones that have been set up are set up by private organizations, private individuals looking to help women. But there's also the challenge of funding these centers. Centers like the Mirabel Center provide forensic and medical support, which now helps victims to be able to go to court and say, this is the evidence presented, and they have a rape kit, so this is what happened, and they can present that as evidence. These centers need to be funded, because individuals like you and I are there helping people to overcome trauma, helping them to get a new lease of life, providing psychosocial support, medical support, and in some cases, free legal support. So organizations such as sexual assault referral centers need to be funded. We have a Federal Ministry of Women Affairs, and I would say that one of the challenges I noted while I was doing my research is a lack of data harmonization at the federal level. So you have a ministry that is overseeing all of this, but doesn't quite have the data to present facts as they are. We need some level of harmonization at state levels. Lagos State is making progress in this regard. They have the domestic and sexual violence unit team, and that is a collaboration of all SACs. So in Lagos State, for example, you have Mirabel Center, you have Warif, you have Sesiara, you have DSVRT. So all of them are under the DSVRT, where they collaborate, where they present data, and they're able to move as one towards curbing sexual and gender-based violence. We need funding for organizations like this. We need funding for organizations like yours that are advocating for women, because we can't outsource governance, but people are doing such important work advocating for women and vulnerable people. They need some level of funding, because your work, for example, involves media and visibility, then there's some level of funding that is required to push that forward. So I would say that, and I also say that it's not just for government alone, also for private organizations. A lot of private organizations say, oh, we're empowering women, we are doing this for women. It's time to put their money where their mouth is. And yeah,
Where the mouth is.
yeah, I would say that.
Yeah. And to close off then, everything that you said, what would you like to call on the media to do to support this kind of vision for the future?
It's time for the media to really understand that gender-based violence is not a hot trend. It's something that affects the lives of real people and could actually has ended the lives of several people that we know. So it's time for the media to report ethically, responsibly, but also to highlight the issues and the gaps. It's time for the media to stop paying lip service. Just one of the things I noted during my research was that the media seem to push the agenda that politicians are doing a lot to curb GBV. I think that it's one thing for politicians to be, we're talking about political will, but it's important for the media to present the full picture. Beyond laws, there are other things that need to be in place for Nigeria to curb gender-based violence. And I've mentioned some of them: funding of shelters, funding of sexual assault referral centers, funding advocacy groups and NGOs and non-profits like yours, pushing. And, so the media needs to highlight the gaps, highlight also the issues that are some, because there's some progress. I mentioned that there are now 32 sexual assault referral centers. It means that someone who has been raped can say, okay, there's a sexual assault referral center there I can go to. So these are the things that need to be highlighted by the media. But most importantly, ethical reporting, so important.
Thank you so much, Soyem. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you and really seeing the passion. The podcast is going to be audio only, but I'm seeing your video and I'm seeing the passion in every word that you're saying. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much. And such important work that you do. Thank you.
This has been a story of passion for using effective communication to change the narrative and how we advocate for survivors and victims of gender-based violence and sexual harassment. I hope, as I have, that you found this episode of Soyem to be one that's enlightening, sets us on a path to take our advocacy to the next level. If you'd like to join me on an episode of this podcast, please contact me at yemisi@africanwomeninmedia.com. You can also visit our main website at africanwomeninmedia.com to find out more about our work. In the show notes, there's a list of organizations and helplines to support you if you have experienced any of the topics we have discussed today. And don't forget, join the conversation using #HerMediaDiary.
Her Media Diary is a product of African Women in Media, an NGO advocating for gender equality in the industry. This episode was hosted by Dr. Yemisi Akinibobola and produced by Fadila Sadal as a part of 5 podcast series on sexual harassment in the media. All music featured in this podcast is by Nana Kwabena. Thanks for listening. Join us again next time.